Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Here are the stories we're following today.
It's Instacart making a splash in its debut. Shares of the online grocery delivery service jumping as much as 43% on the first day of trading. It finished well off that, and we'll get you details on that in just a moment. Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz says that the challenge now is for Instacart to maintain enthusiasm.
That's really what investors and bankers want to see happen is the debut is strong, but it carries on and continues to trade higher. When we look at ARM, which is the largest IPO this year, biggest deal since late 2021, it's actually fallen double digits percentages over the last 3 sessions. So we've seen actually the majority of bigger deals so far this year trading lower than they closed on that first day pop. So initial excitement has typically this year, again, in a choppy market, waned relatively quickly.
That's Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz. Instacart shares are priced at $30. The offering raised $660 million for the company, making it the 4th biggest U.S. IPO this year. Now, in terms of momentum, well, one day doesn't make a trend, but we mentioned how high those shares had gotten. Instacart shares, though, finished up just 12%.
Well, the lawyers overseeing the bankrupt crypto exchange FTX are now suing the parents of Sam Bankman-Fried. He, of course, is the co-founder, former CEO of FTX. The lawyers are claiming the parents, Alan Joseph Bankman and Barbara Fried, used their access and influence within FTX to fraudulently enrich themselves by millions of dollars. We heard earlier today from Bloomberg News senior editor Dave Litka, who tells us basically, based on similar cases, the plaintiffs will likely seek to recover every penny.
You can look at the example of the Bernie Madoff situation where for years it went back to seek money that investors as this fund had held on to for years. It's the basic bottom line is that you can't hold on to money that you obtained illegally through a fraud.
He is David Litka, the Bloomberg News senior editor, that really looks a lot at what's going on in the cryptocurrency space. Now, Sam Bankman-Fried will stand trial beginning next month on charges related to the collapse last year of FTX. Brian?
Well, the OECD, Doug, says that the world economy is set for a slowdown. And the group's chief economist, Claire Lombardelli, says it's hard to tell how far monetary tightening needs to go to tame inflation. Here's Lombardelli speaking earlier to Bloomberg.
We are seeing that monetary policy is working. It is working its way through economies, and we are beginning to see the tide turning on inflation. Headline inflation is coming down in some countries, also core inflation. I mean, you're right that there's a lot of uncertainty around monetary policy at the moment, quite how powerful it is, quite how long those lags will be, as you might expect, given a very long period of very low rates and very low inflation.
The OECD chief economist there, Claire Lombardelli. She went on to say that it's important that fiscal policy works in collaboration with monetary policy, but that economies need structural reforms to get growth going. The OECD projects global growth will ease to 2.7% in 2024 after an already subpar expansion of 3% this year. Doug?
Well, oil prices steady today near 10-month highs. Earlier, Brent crude topped $95 a barrel for the first time since November. We also heard today on oil from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who said the recent increase should stabilize in time. Here is Yellen speaking earlier to MSNBC.
Gas prices are up somewhat. That's not desirable. I think it reflects in part Saudi Arabia's decision to continue oil supply cuts that it put into effect earlier. And of course, the ending of the pandemic in China, even though China's growth is slower than expected, has raised demand for oil. My hope is, and I think what you see built into market expectations, is that they'll stabilize or move down over time.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Now, regarding the American economy, Yellen went on to say the labor market is strong, inflation is coming down, and there is a lot of momentum. She also commented on a potential government shutdown. She said the Treasury has not modeled the impact of a shutdown on the economy, which would depend, obviously, on how long it were to last. Brian?
And a little bit more here on geopolitics. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that she was upset when Huawei, the Chinese producer, released a new phone with an advanced chip during her visit to China last month. However, she noted that the U.S. has no evidence that China is capable of mass producing these components. Raimondo speaking earlier at a congressional hearing.
We're trying to use every single tool at our disposal, BIS, enforcement, patents, to deny the Chinese an ability to, get intellectual property, to advance their technology in ways that can hurt us. The only good news, is there is any, is we don't have any evidence that they can manufacture 7 nanometer at scale. And although I can't talk about any investigations specifically, I promise you this. Every time we find credible evidence that any company has gone around our export controls, we do investigate.
Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo speaking there. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has opened an investigation into Huawei's phone and the purported 7 nanometer chip. Now, we say purported because this chip, made by China's SMIC, was discovered in a teardown of the handset that Tech Insights conducted for Bloomberg News. It's unclear whether SMIC has received approval from Commerce to supply Huawei, which has been blacklisted in the United States. A few other stories we are following that we'll get to a little bit later in this hour. Country Garden leaves bondholders in the lurch as interest payments go unpaid there. There is a 30-day grace period, but it still makes investors nervous. And Doug, in Hong Kong, we have this big crypto push. The government has been trying to get Hong Kong to be a hub here for crypto. And now we get a blunt warning on that. Police arresting 8 people over conspiracy to defraud people. It's the JPEX platform that is in question here, and it has expressed some disappointment over the Hong Kong actions.
Yeah, I saw that police were able to seize millions of dollars in assets. That would include some property and jewelry as well. If you're talking about economic headwinds, I think we have to remind ourselves, Brian, that in a couple of weeks, American consumers will be required to begin making payments on some $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. That's after that 3-year moratorium. And I saw an estimate today, economists saying this could curb consumer spending anywhere from $9 billion a month to $70 billion a year.
Yeah, that is looming. And in fact, one of the first questions I'll put to Nancy Daoud, who's coming up with us, I always enjoy getting her views from Ameriprise Financial, is, are we going to learn this week that there's some fear about something being broken? Perhaps as a result of what the Fed has done, perhaps as you mentioned, some of these other developments. And so we'll get to that in a few moments when Nancy joins us live here on the program. This is Bloomberg. It's time now for Global News. Some of the top speeches at the UN General Assembly today, highlighted by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ed Baxter covers that and has the rest of the global news from the 960 newsroom.
Yeah,
he's in San Francisco,
right.
Ed.
That's right, Brian. Zelensky says if Russia is able to succeed in its invasion,
many seats in the General Assembly Hall may become empty if Russia succeeds with its treachery and aggression.
And says Russia cannot be allowed to use nuclear weapons. He says the globe should notice Russia's use of food as a weapon.
Even now, when Russia has undermined the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we are working to ensure food stability. And I hope that many of you will join us in these efforts.
And Zelensky warns that as a body, things about climate change. He says nations like Russia could use it as a weapon as well. Now, Putin and Xi are not in attendance. U.S. President Joe Biden has met on the sidelines with the leaders of 5 Central Asian countries, former Soviet bloc states.
I'm genuinely looking forward to following up on this meeting because we are stronger, and I genuinely believe the world is safer when we stand together. Our 5 nations.
And then in front of the General Assembly talked China.
We seek to responsibly manage the competition between our countries so it does not tip into conflict. I've said we are for de-risking, not decoupling with China.
And as the UN General Assembly meets this week, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair says the countries have an almost impossible job to do.
So even the UN Security Council, when you think about it, I mean, it's completely irrational that you don't have Germany or Japan or India, Brazil, Indonesia, large countries that aren't represented in the permanent structures of the UN. The difficulty is how do you change those institutions when you require everyone's consent to do it.
Yeah, Blair exclusively in conversation with David Weston here on Bloomberg. So only one country in the Security Council can block any action. And Blair also says countries are trying to keep relations with both the U.S. and China while not aligning with either. China's issued a warning to permanent mission to the United Nations, tell them not to attend an event on the sidelines of the General Assembly dedicated to human rights abuses against ethnic Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang region, even organized by the Atlantic Council and Amnesty International. Now, Zelensky's next stop will be Washington, D.C. He will meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. McCarthy struck a very combative tone today when asked by a reporter about how the meeting will come down.
When you meet with him, will you commit to another round of funding for Ukraine?
Is Zelensky elected to Congress? Is he our president? I don't think I have to commit anything. I have questions for him. Where's the accountability on the money we already spent? What is the plan for victory? I think that's what the American public wants to know.
And he says that he's standing by his assertions that a funding bill will pass. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg.
All right, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. I'm Brian Curtis, along with Rishad Salamat. We are here in Hong Kong. Joining us is Nancy Daoud, private wealth advisor at Ameriprise Financial and the CEO of Opus, Advice First. We will take a closer look at markets. Nancy, great to have you. I'm curious whether or not you think we will learn the answer to this question this week. Does the Fed think, or maybe does it know, that it's already broken something, but it will take a while to materialize? And I mention this because if you remember back to 2007, stocks hit an all-time high then in July, and then look what happened next.
It's hard to answer your question definitively, but we believe that Powell and gang will stay the course, and rates are not going to be coming down anytime soon. In fact, although there may be a pause this month, we really believe that there will be one more hike this year. But I think it's time also for the Fed to start focusing on, how are we going to exit all of this? Now that we've combated inflation and we've been somewhat successful at it, we're not quite there yet, 100%. But we've got to start looking at the other side of this now. And that's, I think, is the big question mark. And tomorrow might be the... Sure.
Quick follow. I mean, if we get a hint from the Fed that they're done, will that scare the market a little bit, in that it may go to that first question, that they realize that there's something lurking there that has already broken?
I don't think so. I don't think that will be the message tomorrow. I mean, I could be wrong and we could all be surprised, but I don't think that will be the message tomorrow. I think it will be important for them to announce or give us some clue as to what's coming up in 2024.
So, as you said, Nancy, people are now trying to look through the other side, as it were, here, and what happens when they're done, and where should you be investing? And clearly, we've got fixed income, as you put it. There is income with fixed income, and it's a good opportunity to get returns without the premium of stocks and stock risks.
Yes.
Now, tell me, where are you looking? Is it in the credit space or the sovereign space?
Absolutely credit. Quality is going to be everything in this scenario. There's definitely a nice opportunity for the returns without the risk with stocks. Retail and banking sectors are probably the highest risk. I would look more towards energy. That seems to be a lower risk, but emphasis absolutely on credit versus duration. And also, munis may be a nice opportunity now, especially if the Fed pauses. Munis are positioned to do well, especially with higher tax brackets.
You mentioned that that there's a mild recession that's still kind of in the picture for you, but that you're not expecting anything too dramatic. When we get a news story today, like Amazon planning to hire 250,000 logistics workers, is that more bullish for the economy than it is for Amazon itself, given the costs, or is it bullish for both? How do you read it?
It's really very difficult to read because on one hand, they just made that announcement, but earlier in the year, they were laying off thousands of people as well. Yeah. So it's just a balancing act, and maybe they're just shifting the workforce. The big key here is that we are starting to see some of the effects of inflation and all of the Fed rate hikes. And credit is tightening, and the money supply is going down. I mean, liquidity is definitely decreasing. And that's, I think, is more of concern for coming up next year.
Well, absolutely, and that's surely one of the reasons why we're seeing that, fixed income, or should I say, the Treasury market so buoyant in some ways in terms of yields. But of course, it's been crushed in terms of price. Now, with that in mind, is it down to perhaps what people are factoring in terms of Fed policy? Is it really genuinely reflecting what's going on with inflation, or is it ultimately a function of that liquidity tightness and also, of course, quantitative tightening itself, which is also perhaps responsible? Plus, I'm going to go, sorry, this is a long question, plus also this massive issuance of corporate bonds that we've seen of late.
It's all of the above, quite frankly. Yeah. I mean, I can't even begin to start to repeat everything you just said, but a mild recession is still on the table, even though it will likely be very short and shallow, nothing too major like what we saw in 2008, because it's a completely different environment. Going from a 0 to 5.5% interest rate was a very significant move. And it's a drastic change. And global cooperation has stopped altogether. There's a lot of home shoring. Inflation is stickier than everyone thought. All of this, and energy prices are rising. So I think at some point we all have to expect that the day of reckoning is going to come. The question becomes is how bad is it going to be, or will there be enough positive things to offset it?
Yeah. So in other words, maybe something isn't exactly broken, but we just need to make a few fixes here and there. We're about Asia, so we got to ask you about China and Japan. First, China, a lot of issues there. You highlight the political troubles, the weak economy, the high levels of debt. Can you touch it?
Well, yes, I think that's ultimately being the second largest GDP in the world. I think that's going to affect the rest of us with what's going on there. I think that there's a lot we don't know, and that's even worse. The hidden is really very, very scary for the rest of us. But the interesting part is Japan is now looking very positive. It's got the lows, the low valuations, the low leverage on balance sheet, low interest rates, low political risk, low structural changes. So all of that provides a good opportunity. But we have to remember that there's nothing that happens fast in Japan. Everything is very slow. And the mindset of the regulators in Japan has changed to the direction of pushing some return on investment for investors. They were never really interested in that before.
Yep, absolutely. We may get some clues from the Bank of Japan this Friday. In fact, a lot of investors on this show said they're looking forward to that meeting even more than the Fed meeting. Nancy, thanks so much for joining us. Nancy Daoud, private wealth advisor, Ameriprise Financial, and CEO of Opus Advice First. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.